cognizant of your time and commitment. And again, thank you all for being here. We expect quite a few more people to join us in the next several minutes. Today's focus it's very exciting. It's part 2 of a racial justice history overview being provided by Shore Denny. So we're going to launch the webinar with our traditional land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that this webinar is being hosted in a region in California that is the unceded territorial home to multiple tribal nations. As we begin this webinar, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our region. We believe a land acknowledgement like this is a critical first step, and it is just as one step toward working with Native communities to create and nurture meaningful partnerships and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. I ask that we all take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds on which we collectively are gathered, and that we endeavor to support the resilience and strength of all Indigenous peoples. I currently am speaking to you as a guest in Oceanside, California, on traditional unceded Luiseño Payamquewicham land. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter today. Again, during our last meeting, I gave a very brief bio of Shore Denny, and a reminder that the first part 1 of the overview of racial justice history provided by Shore has been recorded, and Marilyn has sent out a link to that recording. I heartily recommend that you watch it. It was fantastic and very powerful, very productive. I think part 2 is going to be even more so. There's going to be more time for discussion today. We are asking that you stay muted until you've been recognized to pose a question. You can also pose your questions in the chat box. And Blaine Adams, our Racial Justice Committee co-chair, will be the primary facilitator for fielding questions and recognizing you. Please know that during our next meeting on May 4th, we're going to set aside some time to further discuss the material that we're going to cover today. So going back, Shore Denny is the founder and CEO of Community Now, a nonprofit organization formed over a decade ago to focus on violence reduction and mental wellness programming for service community members. Shore draws on her extensive experience and her master's degree in mental health and wellness to create, implement, and advocate for trauma-informed coping strategies, community prevention campaigns, and mental wellness programming. Ms. Denny provides trauma-informed coaching and training throughout our region and beyond, so I encourage you to contact Shore if you're interested in having your organization or your institution benefit from the sort of training that Shore provides. She does wonderful, wonderful work. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Shore. I know she has a slide deck she wants to bring up. And again, thank you, Shore, and thank all of you folks for being here today.
Good morning, you guys. How are you? I am excited to be here. I will be getting everything organized. I don't know what that was. Here we are. Okay. I will be able to see just a few of you. And as Rafe said, please put stuff in the chat and we will get back to it. I'll have moments of discussion as we go through, and then I will just throw out questions as we're going on. Part 1 was amazing. This is part 2. I don't know why this is part 1 because I didn't change it. So I'm Shore, as Rafe said, and I have a master. I like to go through these slides because this is a safe space. I want you guys to just take a breath, breathe, and settle into this. We got a lot of information that we're going to give, and it might get a little touchy. You might feel a little sensitive because we will be discussing things that usually aren't discussed. Please remember when you're making comments to be polite, kind, have respect. You might not agree with everything that's said, but there's a way to say that, and we agree that you don't have to agree. Right here is I always like to start off with a crisis line 988. It used to be 211, but now it's 988 and it's national. So if you or anyone you know is going through anything where they're overwhelmed at any point, call this number. They have resources. It's not just if you're having suicidal ideation. This is if you are just overwhelmed. They have support and resources that they can provide. So please write that number down. Remember, we always run into people that need support. So this is the must read. I'd like to show this because a lot of stuff that I researched was in this book. I didn't realize that until I read the book. So not much of the book is in here, but again, it's all based on the same information, and that's a great read. So let's get into this. Part one, we talked about pre-slavery, right? Why, sugar, and all of that good stuff. Now, I wanted to, I always thought, why is our system, our social system here in America, why is it the way it's set up? So I wanted to start off with this European hierarchy because I wanted us to get some groundwork on this. Now, back in the European times when fiefdom and all of that, you had the king, you had the lords, and then you had the peasants. So when we're thinking about history, let's just remember where our European friends came from. They came from Europe. They came from a system that had a king, then they had lords and knights, and then they were the peasants. Most of the people that came as indentured servants were the peasants that came here, right? We had the landowners, they came first, they had the power, they made the rules, but most of the indentured servants, they were poor. So if you look on the right-hand side, this is really kind of familiar to what we have today. It looks quite similar. And instead of having the monarchy up top, we've got landowners, right? We've got the corporations. And then instead of it being the knights and the lords, we have the class of white. And then the peasants, the way they had it set up, as you'll see, were the minorities and the slave class. So just kind of, I just wanted to break this down because it didn't change. And it's really interesting to know that our European forefathers, they didn't go far from the bar, right? They just decided that they wanted to be the kings. instead of bowing to the kings, they became the kings in this country. So creation of the caste system. I went here at the end of training number 1 because I wanted to cover all of the racial groups. So I'm coming back to this, thinking of that hierarchy and looking at the creation of the caste system. As we were saying, everybody struggled here. Every group that came had to fight. And what we're looking at here is that the creation of the caste system was an assimilation of groups, of European groups that came here. The Irish, you could say the Greeks, the French, whoever came here, they literally came into an assimilation. If you look on the side, in the 1500s is really when race started being talked about. And in the 16th century, really, race became a thing. So the concept of eugenics, the justifying of the enslavement of peoples, all started here when our forefathers were trying to find their place in this country. At the next slide, what we see is the becoming of white America. And this is where the O'Briens dropped the O, right? They just became Bryans, where a lot of religious groups, they stopped practicing their religion so that they could assimilate into the Christian American system that we have here today. So there were a lot of riots and a lot of fighting that went on. I showed you the Gangs of New York, which was a great movie that showed a lot of how this happened and how the melding of the class of white came to be. But as they fought, we have to remember the indentured servant did their time. They are looking now for the reward. They're getting their money, they're getting their land, and they're trying to figure out, the hierarchy here in this new land. And again, these people are used to being at the bottom. They're used to being the ones that, had nothing. And then there were the landowners. So race and the caste system. America was built not, right now we have a racial overlay. Everybody is thinking that, it started that way. But when you look at the land before it became America, it was multicultural. Everybody owned land. Anybody that came that could own land, owned land. There were no racial restrictions. And what happened was, as race became a thing and sugar became more popular and they needed more plantations, they needed more space and more bodies to grow the sugar, they started building this class system that we now call caste here in America. And it's the infrastructure that was built 400 years ago. That's why I started with that hierarchy, because if you look at it, we're under the same system. It's the same. They really didn't change it. The only difference is instead of the European system being broken by lords and then peasants because they were all of the same race, in this country, the landowners solidified making the class of white by putting a class of peasants under them, right? So the European coming here as a peasant now didn't have to be a peasant. They could be what is called our middle class. And the peasants became the slave class. So instead of it being kings, lords, and peasants, it became landowners, whites, and slaves. Same systems, different groups. And what we saw here in America is that blacks and whites and everybody owned the land. Laws were written that started reducing it based on eugenics. So when the thoughts of eugenics were coming, there were ideals of the master race and creating a better race through breeding. So when we look at eugenics, it was really the study of the Caucasoids, the Negroids, and a way for them to explain slavery and to make it okay that there was this bottom class. So if you came from Europe and you understood that system that they lived under, when you came here, you could feel more, you felt safe and you were able to have a middle ground that you were able to live on. Now, I want us to just really remember that everybody was here. The African was here, the German was here, the Japanese people were here. Everybody was already here. And laws needed to come into place and power needed to be laid. So the next thing that our landowners did as they were trying to control the land was that they created a place to where, say I owned land and I'll pick somebody, Rafe, you owned land. We were here in the country. When this racial system came into place, they started removing by laws, removing the rights of different people, of minority groups. And when they did that, they literally took their land. So say I owned land and you owned land beside me. Well, Rafe, because you were of European descent, they actually gave my land to you. Not only did they give you my land, they gave me to you at the same time. Now that's the indentured servant getting their land and getting their money. So it was their reward, right? So now they're satisfied. They've gotten their land, they've gotten their property, and they're used to having a peasant system under them. They're used to having peasants. So now it was just the Black people. They felt, thank God it wasn't them, because now white people no longer were able to be enslaved. Where in Europe, they were. Now there was a whole enslaved group, and it was called the slave. And they were able to do this. You guys know King Louis and all of the kings that they said that they were kings by God's right, by birth. So that's what they were trying to say here, that is by God's right, that the African was the lowest on the pedestal. It's by God's right that the landlords were, the supreme or the upper class. And this takes us to, if we were all here and we started getting our status reduced, and now I am now the slave of Rafe, and Rafe, you better treat me right. But now that I'm the slave of Rafe, then we want to talk about, well, what did that mean to the social environment? And one of the things that came up is something that we talk about all the time is these Karens, right? And we'll talk a little more about why Karen existed, but the landowners were able, they had power, right? The landowners were over the slaves that were coming in, and everyone had a job with the slaves. All of the Europeans had to watch because the slaves were revolting. They were killing, they were trying to get away. In the beginning, they didn't just come here and say, well, I'm a slave and I'm going to deal with the life. They fought, they massacred, and they tried to get to the shores so they could get on the ships and go back to Africa. The problem was they couldn't assimilate. You could see their brown skin. So they really didn't get far because the people around them were all told that they had to enforce or watch over the African slave. So every Caucasian, every European person in America became like a police officer over all of the Blacks that were here, or the indentured Africans that were here. And today, you know, we wonder, why are these people getting in our business, right? When we saw in the news, especially in the last 2 years, where an African-American person would be somewhere and a Caucasian white person, a woman would come up and say, excuse me, but why are you here? And we all wondered, well, where did they think they had the right? And I want you to know that they have always had the right, because they have always been able to govern over the minorities in this country. So the landowners created slavery, and they created this whole system, right? The white male actually didn't even get the vote until the 1800s. Think of that. When I thought of slavery, I thought all the white people in the country voted and said, we want slavery. And that's how it happened. But that's not what happened. What actually happened is the landowners here saw the value of the land, created laws, and started this racial system so that they could have the power over the lands and over the people. And until 1829, and that's when Andrew Jackson was president. So think of that, he's like the 4th or 5th president. Not until that time did the white male get the vote. Therefore, Caucasian friends, I have to say, none of you, and I'm mixed, but none of us are responsible for slavery, because it was done by the landowner, not by the mass of people, right? They were just here like we were. And if you look at the history back then, Caucasian people up until the 1800s, they had no rights. It was the, what do you want to say it? They were like the assemblymen, or the, you know, they had different names for political officials that had the power and the control, just as they did in Europe. It was like a reflection of their system. So let's get into the slavery. As I said, I always thought there were like 2 big laws that were created, and then pow, slavery was here. But that is in fact not what happened. And I really want you to pay attention, because what has happened before tends to happen again. And some of these things you might see some similarities. So slavery laws passed in Virginia. There were some big things that happened in the 1640s to 1660s, right? That's where a lot of the major laws were put into place that actually locked slavery into the American society. But let's look at this. Can you guys see this? I'm going to stick here for a minute. Now, as we were talking, in 1619, and we know that's when we already talked about the first enslaved Africans that came over here in 1619. So in Maryland, there was a law that said that Blacks should be socially excluded. So this is when race really started coming into our country, right? And you look at 1642 and just think of all the different states with all the different laws, the way that we have them now. In 1642, they started authorizing the branding of the slaves, because remember, there are no slave laws yet, right? These are things that are just becoming. If you start looking from the 1619s, and you start looking down here, you'll see that Blacks are starting to be barred from trade, which means they were in trade to be barred from it. You start seeing that there's a lot of prohibited things of Black and white marriages across many states. And that's because interracial marriage has always been, and they had to enact laws to stop it, to lay this racial overlay on our country. In 1691, was the very first time that white was used in any legal works. And it was actually in a legal system where they banned a white woman for marrying a Black man. And that's the first time white was used. So that's when race was solidified, and just continued to look. In 1712, they criminalized slaves running away, right? In 1715, they forbid Black and whites from being married, forbid Blacks and whites from being married. You'll see it over and over, forbid Blacks and whites from being married. But look at 1790. I found this to be important because a lot of us say, you know, this country was created for all of us. They say this is a land, you know, for minorities. But in 1790, our Congress declared the United States a white nation. And that's where white supremacy, it was solidified in our country. White class ruled. If you look on, you can keep going down, you'll see that they forbid blacks from free blacks from entering states, which means that there were always free blacks in this country, right? We talked about that before. And when we talk about the movement of the blacks being prohibited, and look, in 1815, they literally charged free blacks a fee so that white people could vote. It's just mind-blowing. But look at this again and look, state by state, law by law, the rights of a group of people were taken away all the way to the point of enslavement. All the way to the point of enslavement. Now let's look at what's going on now. Because over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been seeing that voting rights are being under attack, right? Who can vote? When can they vote? So over 200, 300 bills have been put in place to restrict. I had to clear voter registrations, purge, to make it harder for voter ID requirements, mail-in voting, restricting it. I ask you why? Why are they trying to do something that they have done before, right? By different laws, reducing the rights of a group of people. The thing now is it's not just a minority group, it's all of us. And we're all here in California. So I just got my real ID and I want to know, how hard was it for you? Because it was hard for me to get my real ID. There was a lot of information that they wanted me to provide that I really had to go and find. What about the people that can't find it? When we're talking about all of these laws and all of these rules that are being put in place, we really have to look at it, because with over 243 bills in over 48 states reducing our right to vote, at the end of this, who's going to vote?
Oh, thank you.
Who is going to have the right to vote? So right here, I'm going to take a moment and Blaine, do you have any comments, or because I mean, really, I want to know about this concept right here. We were all here, we were all equal. They put laws into place to reduce the rights of a group of people, and in fact, taking them into slavery. They put a media campaign out that said that group was not equal anyway, so it doesn't matter, they're cool down there at the bottom. Think of what's going on today when groups of people are called thugs, when different, media campaigns are going out and they're talking about different groups of people. Who, at the end of the day, is going to be able to vote? Any comments?
There's nothing in the chat right now, but I was just thinking, kind of reflecting over the last couple of pages, thinking how much this is monetarily or financially motivated, to maintain not only the classes, but maybe that notion of fear. And it's not necessarily fear of people of different color, but fear of losing that power, and ultimately fear of losing monetary, benefit.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Okay, and looking on that frame, we're going to get a little icky here. The breaking of a horse. No, a slave. Wait. Are we talking about a human here? When we talk about slavery, we must talk about Willie Lynch and his impact on the slave trade, and really just the treatment of the slave. I don't know how many of you have heard of Willie Lynch, and there's dispute that says that Willie Lynch didn't exist. I would say right now that it really doesn't matter, because what was written in the letter happened. So if he existed, if he didn't, it did. It worked. And what he said, Willie Lynch was British Isles, and think about that, British Isles. The sugar plantations were happening out there. I mean, there was sugar way before there was sugar here. So he had a lot of experience in a very cruel place in the British, the West Indies, and how they treated their slaves. And he brought that information here because our slaves were revolting here in America. They were having a very hard time here maintaining. And a lot of people said, the slaves just stayed here. No, they fought. They tried to get away. And Willie Lynch came with a plan. And he said, if you listen to me and if you follow my plan, the slave will be conditioned for over 300 years. And right here, I just want to say the word lynch. If you've heard of that lynching, that word comes from Willie Lynch, the hanging of people from trees. So Willie Lynch, one of his excerpts, he says, in my bag, I have. And when he was talking about this and he talked about how he was going to condition the slave, it became apparent that he had to focus on the female. He said the female is the key. And one of the things that he did was he rounded up the females and he took the males, the females and their babies, and he took the males and they killed the men in horrendous ways in front of the women, with the women watching. And this is a picture of them horse and quartering, where they literally pulled people apart. They did this in front of the female slave because they wanted her to understand that she could only look to the master. Now, let's think of the regular family dynamic. The regular family dynamic is the husband who has the power, the wife that is supportive, and then the kids. Well, the master here decided that if they changed the dynamic of the family, that they could keep the slave system in place longer. So what they did was they made it so that the women feared the life of the men, right? They killed the men outright, made the woman sit there in a state to where she could not reach to her male counterpart for that support. She had to go to the master for the support, which broke the family unit. It switched it so that the man is not in front, but the woman is now in front because she's protecting her male. Now think about this. It's not just through slavery that we are talking about this. And that's why I'm saying that some of these situations have perpetuated we're over 400 years now from slavery, and this situation is still going on. So what he said was, when we do this, the female will start to raise her children in reverse roles. She will raise the male to be strong but weak in mind. She will keep him out of the forefront, keep him from being seen, that she will put the female, her daughter, out there to, negotiate and to deal with the overseer and the master, because the Black men were getting killed and the Black boys were getting killed. Think about these mentalities as we're talking about corporal punishment today. Because, let me make another slide, because when I'm talking to educators and I'm talking to people out in the field, and when we're talking, who do you usually see coming up to the door to talk about the family problems, to talk about any situation? Is it the male in the Black community that comes, or is it the female? Does anybody know?
Well, sure. In my experience, K-12 and higher ed, despite race, putting race aside, it's the mothers, it's the females primarily. There are some exceptions, but particularly in K-12 with people of color, it's the mothers, it's the females, in my experience.
Yeah, and I can echo even at times when I would need to get a note home from school for behavior, it would be written to my mom. I would think. So even notes for positive or negative things would always be directed to my mom too. So now that I think about it.
Yeah. And that's something that we really don't realize has happened in our community, but it has. The women, and then we wonder in a Black community, well, why is a woman so strong? And you hear these things in our community talking about, well, I can't beat a man husband if you are, because of the role of the woman and how the woman's been raised in our communities. But also to remember that it's because we care and we're worried about our men. I'll come back to that point of we're worried about our men as we move on. Right there is just, I want you to understand the concept of what Willie did and how this impacts our social identity, right? So as African Americans, we've been called a bunch of names, right? The N-word, colored, African American, Black, we've got several different names. Who gave us these names? Did we do it? Are these our identities? When I was looking at our social identity, I was really impressed at how well this society suppresses and creates stereotypes, right, of the others. Now, I showed you back in the beginning, and that's why I went back to the gangs of New York, because I want you to see that this force of assimilation is happening, through all of the racial groups. It's not just the African-American or Latino groups. It's just simply that we can't assimilate, right? My color will not change. Therefore, I cannot assimilate into European society. So as our social identity, on the right side, there will be a couple of slides where you're going to see how we've been depicted through time. Remember, in the beginning, African Americans were only in one part of the country, really, right? And they were slaves. Everywhere else where Caucasians were, they didn't know us. They've never met us. And all they knew was how we were depicted in social media, right? We call it today, but through the media. So look over here as the minstrels. They did a great job on depicting African Americans as lazy, stupid. A lot of the stereotypes that we hear of today came from the minstrels in the vaudeville period, right? So when we're talking about the words Negro, colored, Black, African American, actually, the only one we really gave to ourselves was African American. And that name was presented to us from Jesse Jackson. And he decided that we needed to have a heritage, because with the words colored, with the words Negro, we could only look to our color, and we could only look to America for our history. And that meant that we would be, in their minds, a broken group, right? Slaves. But if we were called African American, well, then we could look back to our homeland and have dignity. We could, as a group, feel pride in being African American instead of coming from a slave group. So that's why African American became, and why it kind of really stuck. Nowadays, you talk to us, some of us, we want to be called Black, some of us want to be called African American, but census-wise, African American is what we're called. On the right-hand side, again, you can see how we've been depicted in media through America. But my question to you is, when you go to Germany, are they called Black Germans and white Germans? When you go to France, are they Black French? Or are they all just called French? Because I ask you, why are we called Black Americans when we are just American? And how can we change that, you guys, to where we are called American? It shouldn't matter about our color. No other country does it. Why do we? So just for a second, depictions, again, of the others, right, that are not able to assimilate into white America, and how they are always depicted in pretty negative ways, lazy, stupid, mean, bad. So in Riverside, where I was, there's a school there called the, oh God, I think it's Sherman's Indian School. It's in Riverside. And I wanted to do this because, again, as we're talking about assimilation and we're talking about all of the different groups that were impacted here, look at this. So the American Indian in the boarding school started in 1860 and lasted until the 1920s. And through that time, they removed everything from the native, right? They took their hairstyles, their clothing, their costumes and jewelry. They took their food, their language, and turned them or tried to assimilate them into white. It didn't work that well, but as you can see in these pictures, they definitely did it. And the Sherman Indian School in Riverside is still existent today. And now I believe they work to build Native pride rather than taking it away. That we have a large history of trying to strip our people, the people in this country, to make them into this Christian white idealism of America. And here they said it quite clearly, right? Kill the Indian and save the man. Because it wasn't his fault he was raised Indian. But we can turn him into what we want him to be.
Sure. Could I add something about the boarding schools?
Yes.
As I think you know, I've served as president for 2 tribal colleges over time, one in Oklahoma and one in South Dakota. And in both settings, members of my board, who were older than I was at the time, had been boarding school students. So there were boarding schools still operating in Indian, what they've referred to as Indian territory, well into the 1970s. So, and they were subjected to that. People that I knew and still know were students in some of those schools.
Isn't that horrifying?
Well, it's absolutely horrifying, and they were greatly traumatized by it. And those people are still alive, the people that I'm referring to.
Any comments? At this point, I'm going to go into a video that I want to show. So any comments to this point?
No, there are none in the chat. I just was still taken aback that you said that it continued to the 1920s, and just kind of looking at how long of a time period that is. It's just much larger than I think I would have guessed anyway.
Well,
Yeah.
again, Blaine, some of those schools were still operating into the 1970s.
Can you guys see my screen?
Which doll?
Can you guys see my screen? Okay, so as we're talking about social identity, I know a lot of people have seen this video, but I want to show this because this is the impact of what media has.
This is the black doll.
Can you hear it?
Yes.
And which one is the white doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
See?
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
So, ouch, right? When we're talking about our social identity, we really have to be careful because our identity is really connected to what we see in our society, right? So when we're talking about all of the depictions of, and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, is that my screen still? I'm
Yes.
sorry.
I'm sorry.
Hold on a second. Technical difficulties. So
We see you.
So can I get some comments on that before I move on? Do you guys see that? Do you see it in your life? Because I can tell you what I feel in my life, but I'd like to hear if you guys have any impact of that video.
Two comments. One was it breaks their heart, and then identified it as internalized racism.
But sure, I got a comment because it also shows us that from an early age, our young kids are, know the difference between black and white and feel that because you're darker or because you're black, you are bad somehow, and that depicts that. So that's why it could be, heartbreaking that someone put in the comment because it starts at such an early age.
And it does. It starts at the womb when we really talk about it and how we're created, how we are, words are killing me. They're killing me today. And how we are treated, right? How our mothers treated in the hospital through, maternity. I mean, I think Curly's on here, one of my friends, and she's with maternal health, and how it starts in the womb, this racism and how we are treated, and then how we feel about that treatment, right? And how it impacts us. And it's at a molecular level. But
Right.
think
That's
about our youth in the schools and how they're acting out, and how some of that acting out is simply could be just self-disdain. I'm not going to say
Sure,
self-hatred.
can I also add that this really demonstrates the psychological trauma that have been imposed on our race from the beginning and what carries on through today. We're traumatized.
Most definitely. And again, the
and I want to
conditioning,
support that thought.
we are traumatized. And that leads to the Willie Lynch effect, right? Two things that I want to bring from this is corporal punishment. And this is with a lot of groups, but in an African-American group, that corporal punishment that we do, a lot of us, they say, my parents would say, I'm gonna beat you so that the police don't, right? I'm gonna get you so that, and I want to go back to where we were talking about how the family dynamic changed with the Willie Lynch effect. And actually from that video, what we see here, because a lot of times people say, well, you know, they killing each other with that gang violence and they're killing each other. So what difference does it make? Well, looking at that video, let's talk about how we have a bit of self-hatred towards ourselves when media is portraying us as bad and evil. And then why wouldn't we shoot each other? Not the question of, oh my gosh, they do, but over 400 years of conditioning to say that we are bad, and as you saw in that video, I think we would be surprised if we weren't killing ourselves. I hate to say it that way, but with you know, the things that we have going on, the conditioning. So another thing is that beating thing, right? And I talked about that in that corporal punishment. And what I want to go back to that is because corporal punishment, I'm going to beat my child so that they don't get killed in the streets. We've got to go back to the slave patrols. We've got to go back to where the police are harming our men. And we have to bring that to the forefront. Yes, it was in slavery. It was the overseer. It was the plantation owner. But today, it's the police and how they impact us. So when we're talking about race, I wanted to bring up another thing that goes with this self-hatred is that there's something that's called an allostatic load. And this is a thing that says that people that are dealing with racism feel it at a molecular level. It's cellular. And at that means that we are always, our body is always in defense. We're always ready for the alert, for that harm to come. And our bodies being in that heightened state of awareness means that our immune system is always under attack. And that means that our bodies get sicker easier. So when people are talking about, oh, African Americans, you know, they have high blood pressure, you know, don't eat that pork. I say to you that it's racism that increases our blood, not pork. We really need to start looking at how we've been conditioned to thinking that things about our bodies are our fault, when it is not. It's actually the society that we live in. I went to a doctor and I was at my doctor and he was saying something. He said, well, you know, African Americans, you know, their bodies are more susceptible. And I stopped him and said, wait, but the study shows that the allostatic load, that our bodies are so susceptible because of the stress. And my doctor backed up and said, oh, you're right. I'm learning. I just learned about that. So I'm asking, if you're learning that, why are you not telling us that? Because it's a very big difference from my doctor telling me, you know, your body's under a lot of stress from the things that it goes on day to day, and you might need to look at, you know, this for your health benefit or that for your health benefit, rather than him telling me, well, you know, as a Black person, your body's weaker and, you know, you need to deal with it, you know, in this way or that way. So again, we need to look at our systems. How are our systems talking to us about these issues? And do they even understand why these things are going on, right? So the allostatic load. And I challenge you to go to your doctor with these things that we have going on and ask them, could this be stress? Could it be the undue harm, you know, that stress of my body is going under with my experience here in America? Because high levels of discrimination are associated with disease and premature death. So is there, before I go into, are there any comments or?
Rosa said that it's the cultural differences in the health field. And actually to build on that exact notion, I was going to say it all comes down to accessibility and access, just across the board, really. I mean, there's so many different types of access, but absolutely the cultural differences between the levels of access still remains glaring.
Yes, yes.
I just wanted to add on the stress idea. It wasn't until I retired quite a few years ago that my health improved. And I was getting older and older, but my health was improving because of the stress levels from my job. It was a high level of stress. And I was coming down every week with the cold, or I was coming down with stomach problems such as IBS, and all of this disappeared once I retired. And I wasn't in that environment, that stressful environment. Stress kills.
It does.
Adana, you have your hand raised? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just was watching something on TV a little while ago, and they were talking about the differences and the treatment of African American women when we're in the hospital having babies. And it's not just a color thing. Well, it is just a color thing because it even happened to Serena Williams. So this is a millionaire, a very rich celebrity woman, and they did not believe she was in pain, did not believe the things that she was saying. And if she wouldn't have had the resources to get herself to another place, she could have lost her life. So I just wanted to say it goes all the way up in our community.
Yes, yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Excellent points. And then Curly also threw in on the chat that epigenetics too, racism changes the way our genes express themselves.
Yes, they do. So let's talk about the police. A lot of, when I started this year, several years ago now, I wanted to answer a lot of questions that were out there, and the police was one of them. And a lot of people were like, what is up with Black people and the police? Why is there such a, this conflict? And I just wanted to bring around that the police started from slavery, right? The overseers and the slave patrols that were at the time of slavery is how the police force started. So as I was talking about the Karen, and when we were talking about how when the landowner started taking over and putting slavery into place, that everybody had to watch the slaves. And again, y'all remember the slaves weren't just sitting there going, well, I guess I'm stuck. They were trying to get out. So the institution of slavery and every person that was in the South had to watch, and they became the slave patrols and the night watches. And there's a movie, The Watchers, I think is the name of the movie, is called The Watchmen. And if you watch that, that's a very good movie that talks about some of these things. But slave patrol and night watches, they later became the police. So think of this, you were enslaved, emancipation came, you were freed, but yet the overseer that used to be your overseer is now the police. So you got no break, right? So you were beating me when I was a slave. None of those relationships change other than instead of him being the overseer, he's now the police. And think of the mentality that went into the police departments as they were created from the slave patrols. And the slave patrols were only created to monitor the slaves, right? Where are they moving? What are they doing? Are they harming? That's all that the slave patrol was there, to make sure that they were where they were supposed to be, when they were supposed to be there. And that's literally what the police do today. So when we're talking about that, look at the top, it says the plantation police. This is in 1858, the plantation police. What is that? Why are the police and the Black people, why is there such a conflict? And it is because they are treating us the same way as they were treating us when we were in slavery. The doctrine of the institution of the police department didn't change that much. I mean, it became broader, course, to all races. But as we see, and the bottom here, the caution colored people, they have never been trusted because the police were putting free Blacks sending them to the South and putting them into slavery. So that's some history on the police department and why we have had such conflict. And as the time has gone on, we have looked and we have seen that time after time, different projects and programs have come into place. Black Lives Matter. And when Black Lives Matter came, it was because of police brutality and the killing of Black people. And they said, we have a right to be here. Black Lives Matter. And when that happened, all other people came and decided that every other life mattered. Of course they do. That's not what Black Lives Matter was about. And that's why this side says that pro-Black isn't anti-white. We were simply saying we deserve to live too. We deserve to live too. Now, Colin Kaepernick, you know, when he started kneeling, everybody was like, what the heck? How are you kneeling against our flag? You're gonna kneel during the pledge? How horrible that was, right? And they wanted to know, well, what's he doing it for? What's he doing it for? Why in the heck is this Black man kneeling at the flag? And what we found is that Colin said he was sick of police brutality and he wanted to bring awareness to the fact that so many Blacks, you guys, daily, Blacks are killed by the police daily, multiple daily, not just one a day. And at the time that this was happening, people were being killed in their homes. We didn't even have to go outside. And then it happened, right? The killing of George Floyd. And the police were so arrogant and they stood in our faces on video and just killed that man as they had a right, as if they had a right. And then we saw all kinds of police conflict going on, right? And we saw, again, you know, police violence, it wasn't just towards minority. Police violence is police violence, and it was towards all. So we went into the streets, we yelled, we fought, and we protested for what, a year? I think a year of full-on protests every weekend. I can't breathe. Not only did we do it, but the world cried out. And the world said, yes, Black lives do matter. And we have started into a whole new journey in our racial understanding of ourselves and how we are in this country as we have all grouped together. And a call that has continued to go out is to restructure the police. What are the police's function? Now that we know that they started off at the slave patrol, maybe we can understand why there is some restructuring that needs to take place. Maybe why there's some training that needs restructuring of that training that needs to go on so that they understand that they have different objectives than just to route and maintain the position of the Blacks in their communities. I'm gonna go back one slide. Anyone have anything on the police brutality, the restructuring, any comments on any of that section?
I was thinking that when the focus started shifting towards, you know, it was not necessarily restructuring the police, but for some reason the words got synonymous with defunding, right? And even, you know, I don't really know why that happened, because a defunding is not going to actually recreate a restructuring. So it should be a focus of restructuring. You take the money away, but the hatred or the misguided violence and all of those things aren't gonna occur because there's less money in the department. If anything, defunding may cause people to increase their levels of frustration and take it out on more people in the streets. So that whole ambiguous use of restructure and refund or defund, it kind of got a little murky, and I think it kind of started to miss the aim or miss the target of what the goal was.
Yeah, exactly what Blaine said. I wanted to raise the same point. It was unfortunate to use the terminology defund. It was restructure and reallocate, I think, was the initial impetus, but absolutely restructuring is absolutely necessary in every sort of policing everywhere in the United States of America. And I do think there should be some reallocation of resources away from this frontline emphasis on policing. It needs to change. So thank you, Blaine.
And there was a hand up. Was it Kira?
Yeah, it was me.
Okay,
Hi.
go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that. I know I have a lot of friends in the space who talk about defunding the police. And I think it's a situation of more of an internal conversation that got raised to a national level, because a lot of the activists who discussed defunding the police were on the ground levels and in places where their police forces have enormous amounts of funding and other things don't. And I don't think it was ever meant to be a national conversation in the way it became. But, you know, in the world of social media, anything can suddenly become on the national conversation, even when
Yeah.
it's not planned to be.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, and I mean, and it does need to happen, right? We need to really review what our penal criminal justice system is supposed to look like. And we know right now that it's set up with a bias, because we know that America was set up with a bias of white supremacy. So we know that there are biases within our systems. So with the restructure, it's really just taking the biases out, right? Take the bias out. I think we have two
A couple
questions.
of hands. Curly, you were first. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks, Miss Jenny. I wanted to also just piggyback on with the police part, the killing of Tyree Nichols, and just the fact that internally the racism, it's just within the system so strongly that even though it was all Black males that did this killing, that it's a reflection of the racism that's a part of the system. And so I wanted to just point that out.
Definitely, yes.
And Thomasina, go ahead.
Yes, I also wanted to kind of piggyback on Blaine's. When you go to all of these issues, it goes back to money, finances. I sat in on a budget meeting for the city of San Diego. And when you looked at the distribution of funds, the police department got the majority. And what they discussed was how other supporting committees didn't get not even a fraction of what the police department was getting, and was asking for even more to aid in overtime payments. So when we look at the restructuring of the police department, you also have to bring into focus financial. You know, where is the funding going? Can we use more funding in mental health? Can we use more funding in community organization? So I think, you know, we really have a long way to go in restructuring the police.
Yes, yes. And, you know, thank you for that. And what I've seen lately is our big organizations are getting bigger, and our small CBOs in them are going away. They're failing. It's like larger organizations are taking on the jobs of the smaller companies. And so with restructure the police and what you were saying, yes, I think that those smaller CBOs and those other organizations, it's almost like the police department wants to absorb it into it so that it does the work, you know? Blaine?
Yeah, as we talk about defunding too, you know, restructuring was, you know, should have been the main focus and the terminology and the goal coming out of all the travesties that have happened. But I still do think that there's validity to defunding. You know, even as a younger person, I was able to see the warning signs of what was happening when in moves across the country, in the highest crime rates, where there was a lot of gang violence, there was a lot of killings going on, you know, from on both coasts. Some of the moves that were made were addition to funding so that there were additional task force, stronger weapons, automatic weapons, you know, basically tanks that were given to police forces. And so in those times, in those places, it may have been applicable to have those kinds of counteroffensive defenses for the levels of crime that were happening. But then all of a sudden you see small towns in Wisconsin saying, well, if LA has that, why don't we have that? And you have towns and small cities across the country then gearing up with weapons they don't need, tanks that they don't need, and then that entitlement and that strengthening of power, you know, you have those weapons, you're going to use them. You know, you want to look for a reason to use them. So those kind of things over the last 2 decades, as you start militarizing different levels of police in areas that barely have a crime rate, you're going to start seeing those weapons and those defense mechanisms used just because they exist there now.
Right, right,
Exactly.
definitely. So here I want to talk about mobs. In history, we've had a lot of white mobs that have come in, and they've come all the time. I start with the 1918 mobs that started when African Americans went to World War I. They came back, the men came back in their uniforms. They were proud to wear their uniforms and they were walking around in them. But the Caucasian people didn't like the fact that the Black men felt that they had that pride and they could do that. So across the nation, they started shooting, and you'll read in history, there were the Chicago riots. They were all across the nation where men in uniform were being shot down, to the point to where African American men stopped wearing their uniforms out in public because they were getting killed. And then, you know, we look at, there are other things in different mobs, and I'm going to highlight another mob, but right here, I just want to talk about January 6th. So what was that, 2020? So when I went back a few slides, we go back, we were talking about Colin Kaepernick, and he knelt. The outrage of the people, they were outraged that he knelt at the flag, right, at the Pledge of Allegiance. I tell you that the same people that were mad at Colin for kneeling went to our Capitol and peed and pooped, all in our Capitol. They were upset about the kneeling, and they went and did that. Now, there's another white mob that we want to, oh, I must not have put it in here. Okay, there's another white mob, and that is Wall Street, right? Black Wall Street. And that was in 1921, and it was a situation where a girl stepped into an elevator, got her foot stepped on, she yelled, and it turned into a major event. In 2 days, the town was devastated, right? Greenwood, which was an affluent African-American neighborhood. The city was bombed. Now I ask you, who has bombs? And how do you bomb a city? So not only was the Wall Street massacre a group of white people that went and killed over 300 Blacks for no reason in 2 days, but the government, the National Guard, bombed their own city. There's this thing that we talk about, generational poverty, and I had to really go into this. Generational poverty, what is it? What does it mean? This is a group of chain gang, and they are here from the early 1900s. The reason that they are here is because of the Black codes. So we'll talk about, well, the 1800s, we'll talk about the Black codes. So generational poverty, and again, I have stuff, you know, for you to look at. Generational poverty, I had to look it up. What is generational poverty? And they said that it is 2 generations. If you have been poor for 2 generations, then that is generational poverty. So I said, okay, well, what's a generation? So a generation is 30 years. So 60 years, that would be my mama's life and my life. So my mama and me, if my mama was poor and I'm poor, we're in generational poverty at that point. So then I started looking at that generational poverty. Do you know that we have, I'm going to say Hispanics, minorities across this country that are in 7 generations of poverty, 8 generations of poverty because of the systems that we live in, right? So let's kind of break that down. 60 years, 2 generations, huh? So slavery ended in 1864. In 1865, the Black codes came, and so slavery repressed, right? It repressed economic growth, right? We were slaves, no economic growth as a slave. So then that minority group came out of slavery, and in 1865, we went into the Black codes. The Black codes leveraged white supremacy and made it so that the slaves could not actually do anything. It limited what they could do as work, and actually forced them into sharecropping. So they thought they were free. They thought they could do what they want, but these laws were quickly put into place to limit where they could move, what they could do, and the power was still with the white people. So the Black codes continued to last, and Blacks that didn't want to go with the program and didn't want to be the sharecroppers and didn't want to be under the thumbs of the, their ex masters were put into jail, which became our new form of slavery here in this country, right? Our prison system. So many Blacks became sharecroppers, and they were told that they'd get that 40 acres and a mule. How many of you heard about that 40 acres and a mule? How many think that that was something good? That wow, they were going to give them 40 acres and a mule. Who thinks that that would have been a good thing? Could somebody give me their understanding of the 40 acres?
I just think it was a deploy. It was, to get them thinking that they were going to get something based on the federal law, but there was never any intention to fulfill it at all. Like everything else.
Yeah.
Never their intention.
And thank you for that, Phyllis. And the thing is, you're right. They didn't mean to do it, but let's talk about the concept. 40 acres and a mule. These are farmers, right? 40 acres. That makes sense. I got emancipated. You're going to give me something. You're going to give me 40 acres. Yes. And I'm going to have 40 acres. Fred's going to have 40 acres. Gerald is going to have, we're all going to have 40 acres, right? And they're going to give us all a mule. We all get a mule.
Right. That's the beginning.
So think about that mule for a second, because I'm telling you that they set us up for failure in the beginning, because you guys, mules do not reproduce. So if I have 40 acres with the mule, I only have the life of that mule. How am I going to make enough money to get a horse to mate with my mule? And if Fred has a mule and John has a mule, we're not mating. We only have the life of that mule, which means that they set us up for failure. It was never for success. It was set up for failure. So we really have to be careful when they're saying they're giving us something, to really check out what they're giving us, because we then would have failed. They would have given us tools and we would have failed publicly. And how would we have come from that? I gave you something, and look what you couldn't even do it with you couldn't even make it with the 40 acres and the mule, instead of realizing that we were set up.
Yeah, it was basically marketing, right? A distraction, a commercial, something to get you sold on here's a little benefit. Now shut up and just kind of take this and stop making excuses. If you can't make it work with this, it's no longer our fault, it's your fault. All those things, the whole laundry list of insinuations that go with something like that, really meant to just, in 20 years, this is going to make us more empowered. Just we give this away, sacrifice a little time, let them fail. We can even reinforce the amount of power that we have over this group of people.
Because they're really beaten then, right? We thought we could do it, and we failed ourselves. It's not your fault now. Now I know I'm a failure.
Right.
Because it was their box.
It's like the first lemon law.
It was check the box.
Yeah.
I gave them this. They failed. They whatever. But if you look down history and everything that you're sharing, Shorn, it's just so amazing. It's checking not our boxes, it's checking their boxes.
Exactly.
And that's why we're still talking about this leading to reparations right now. That's why we're still having the conversation.
Exactly.
Because all of it was intentional. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Going back on mute. You're doing a great job.
Thank you, Phyllis. So Jim Crow, I said the Black codes, they were in existence. Jim Crow came right off the heels. So slavery, 1864 ended. Black codes came in 1864-5. Black codes ended in 1867, 68, and 1870, the Jim Crow laws came. So again, I'm talking about economic suppression here, right? When did we have time to make this money? This is where I'm trying to go. So in 1800 with Jim Crow, people of color were not able to get skilled work. As you can see, the sign there says whites only, right? So we weren't able to get good jobs. We were really limited to lower paid positions, cooks, stewards, you know, those famous things that maids, you know, laundry washers. There were no pensions and retirements for any of our jobs, although our Caucasian counterparts were getting retirements, they were getting pensions, right? There were many died in debt. And to this day, we see people on corners with signs saying, please help me bury my, you know, my loved one. So they died in debt. When my father died, I got a bill. That's what I'm going to say. I haven't had the luxury of getting an inheritance yet. That's not in my generational thing, hasn't happened yet. When we're looking at that, that means that a lot of our people and minorities, we go into debt when our people die. We don't get a bonus. You know, we didn't get that new house, you know, my mama's house. Oh, now I got my mom's house, you know, no. Youth of color did not receive the same education. They said segregation, but it was not equal. It was segregated, not equal. And people of color in neighborhoods received less funding, right? We know about the redlining. We'll talk a little bit about that. I actually wanted to show that Herbert Hoover, you know, when we're talking about our government, y'all, Herbert Hoover and these slogans that they get in place, that make America great again. How about American jobs for real Americans, right? And during this slogan, during the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover had all these large agencies literally lay off their minority workers, lay them off and hire white. And not only that, he gave them subsidies for doing it. So imagine thousands of people, minorities, that got laid off during the Depression so that Caucasian people could work. The land covenants, right? Restricted access to housing. It's still today. I think, you know, and I don't get me wrong, I've tried to move and live and move into some areas here in Oceanside where I live, and I'm not sure if all of these land covenants are gone. I think that there are still some of them around. So there are still places that we cannot live, right? Or that they're classing us out of. So this was big back in our history, and as I said, still today, that there are just places we couldn't live. And then this slide is way out of place, you guys. I apologize for that. Here's that slide I was looking for. I don't know how it moved in my deck. But this is the Tulsa massacre. And as you can see, the fire up there where it got bombed. I'll have to fix that later. I don't know how that got. I knew I had that slide though. I want to do this. I'm going to exit out of here, and I'd like to show this little video. Do you guys, any comments while I'm setting this up?
Well, sure. I wanted to throw in and piggyback on something Blaine said about the use of military hardware in cities. And as many of you know, that was a product of our interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. And there was a lot of surplus military hardware, tanks et al. Rolling around. And so our federal government created programs and offered those, the military weaponry to police departments all over the country. And sure, you asked, well, how could you bomb part of your own city? There's a corollary there to what happened in Tulsa in the 1920s. The planes that were used and the bombs that were used were surplus from World War I. That's where the National Guard got the material to do what they did in Tulsa. So you talked about themes, recurring themes, and history repeating itself. We've seen that.
We've seen that, right?
With those two.
Which means it'll do it again. If it's did it before, that's a song. It did it before.
And when you talk about
Because
the
it's
bombing
not the
of cities,
bombs, it's somebody making the decision to bomb Tulsa, to bomb, you know, whatever. It's somebody making that decision. And that's who we need to identify and understand, like what white supremacy is all in it now. And they're going to do what they feel like they want to do. Mhm. So that's my
Honestly, you
piece.
think so?
I just wanted to add, you talk about bombing the city. In Philadelphia, and I was a resident at that time, they bombed an entire community because they wanted a group of people out of that community. There was a movement called the MOVE, a group of people there, and the mayor, along with the police chief, decided, well, we'll just drop this little bomb on them. So bombing a community is not restricted to the 1920s. This happened in the 1980s as well.
Wow.
Yeah, Bruce Springsteen wrote a song about that, about the Chicken Man in Philadelphia. Yeah.
And then real quick too, once we start linking it, I go back to the term accessibility, right? We were talking about it with medical accessibility and healthcare accessibility. You have accessibility to this kind of these levels of weapons. They're going to get used. If
That's
they're
what you
there
said.
and they're accessible, they're going to get used. It also can be linked to the pervasiveness of gun violence in our country. There's that many guns. They're that easy to get. That's why it's going to be easy for people to use them to kill groups of people. So, it's just become so free to get these kinds of things from the citizen level to the government level on up, that you can just kind of disperse them and use them in communities and neighborhoods and cities where, you would have once thought that's unheard of. But, as you can see, this has happened through decades, and even centuries.
Right. And what my fear is that, let me see, am I unmuted? Yes, I am. Is that, no, the people that are going to green light this they're putting them as our leaders in Congress, that will green light weaponizing our cities, and usually the cities of color. They're becoming the people that will green light and legislate and push these bills forward. That's why we have to stay diligently, because whoever, I'm not going to say political party, I'm just going to say whoever is in sort of to change the democracy and keep weapons out there. I don't know why you need a AR. What do you need that just in, I don't know, in your life? I don't know. But people that are writing this and that are saying that these are necessary because it's our right to bear arms, we need to not let them be our legislators.
Yeah.
We can't
vote. We need to vote, and we need to,
we need to vote. We need more than vote, but but you just need to be, they're on your city councils now. They are on your school boards. They are doing local initiatives. They're being involved so they can move up the ranks.
Yeah.
I'm just
One thing
gonna
we always
say
have to
that.
go back to. We always have to go back to the financial root. So it's surplus from a war, like that
It
Doug
is.
said, surplus from a World War I. So the
You're
decision
absolutely right.
sometimes is, if we can reuse this surplus and put some money back into the federal government's pocket, okay, let's disperse these all around the country too. So the financial root is always underlying there as well.
Right.
Absolutely. But we need to keep them off the streets. Gotta do it from both sides.
Okay. So here's a quick video. Again, we're talking, this is generational poverty. Can you guys see this? First of all.
Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and get accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with Black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the Black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
I really like that video. It says so many things. Anybody have any thoughts on that while I'm bringing my screen back up?
Sure, I do want to interject. I think that's brilliant, and I would like to start our next meeting with that again. And just want to remind everybody, we're starting to lose people. People are saying they have other meetings to jump to. We're going to continue this conversation during our May meeting. So sure, that might be a good thing to start with, that video, but I'm going to turn it back to you now until 11:30 and hope everyone can join us again for a continued conversation at our May 4th meeting. And we will send out the agenda for the May 4th meeting by no later than the 27th of this month. So thank you, Shore. Take it.
Okay, we have a few slides, but what I really am interested here is that in our next conversation, when we come together, I can finish this up a little quickly. After affirmative action happened, right? That was our country trying to say, wow, we did something wrong and we're going to try to fix it right here. And so in 1964, affirmative action actually hit, the Civil Rights Act happened, and quotas came into place. And they were like, you know, you can get more opportunity for minorities by having these quotas put in place. And remember, before it was whites only. And so for me, this is something that I feel closely because I came, I'm old, y'all, but I came in, and when I was looking in the workforce, I went into San Diego and I got in accounting, and I was working in the coal building. And there's like 2,000 people in that coal building, right? A lot of businesses, a lot of work. And I was the only Black out of 2,000 employees in that building. And the only reason I got the job is because my name is Shore. And when they got my resume, they couldn't tell what race I was. So affirmative action ended. Well, President Reagan, he kind of got in there and started ending it. But the Black Power movement came, right? And that Black Power movement came again because in the 1960s, there were killings and all of the oppression that was going on. The Black Power movement came. Blacks started gaining confidence and they started moving around in the world. And our country didn't really like it. So in 1970s, they started a war on drugs. So in 1966, our government actually pushed crack cocaine into our inner cities and broke our families, stopped the Black Power movement, and gained funding for their Contra and Nicaraguan wars by feeding drugs to our families. Economic suppression, you guys, slavery, 1619 to 1865, Jim Crow, 1865 to 1964, over 345 years. Affirmative action, I'm just gonna say it started in 1964, and let's say it's up till today. Let's give it the 59 years, we can do that. That would still only be 59 years that our group has been working towards economic equality. Remember, it takes 60 years to even get out of generational poverty. So none of our families, basically from this map, have come out of poverty.
I think
Due to institutional racism. And that's why we are talking about reparations right now. If all of those things were proper, were equal, where equity was, we could be at the same place as the Rockefellers, the Hiltons, all the Kennedys, all the families that use free labor to make themselves wealthy. And Black America, African America, whatever you want to call us, we are now asked, yes, we're saying that we made you whole. It's time for you to make us whole. As a family, as a generation, because we built this country and we are Americans.
Thank you, Phyllis. So that's right. That's why we're here at reparations.
And sure, I think right now this will be a good place. We have to stop. We're at time. But I think, like Dr. Trickey said, I think a revisiting of that video and the last two slides to the full group next month, just as a recap. I think it'll be a strong reintroduction to the conversations that we're having. And even if it's not the perfect slide to stop for you, I still think it was a good landing spot because it kind of gives us a transition into the next parts of our conversation. And I want to thank you very much because this is as informative and with new information as the last one. So I'm even excited for the third installment.
Well, thank you. Thank you, you guys, for your time. And I hope that this starts a lot of conversations and that we can come together in the next meeting and we can really start talking about solutions because we are the answers, right? We are the answers.
Yeah, we have a lot to cover. Sure, thank you. As Blaine said, I think that'll be a good launching point for May 4th. And thank you everyone who participated today. The conversation will continue with Shore on May 4th.
Thanks again, everybody, for your participation and joining us today. We'll see you next week. Please take care of yourselves.